The purpose of this video is to show you the construction of the Bentley 3.5 and 4.25 liter rear and front hubs. Also the correct method of using the hub removal tools which you have rented from the Rolls-Royce Owners Club. In disassembling the hub, these are the parts that you will find in the hub, and they are listed in the order that they will come apart. First of all, we have the wire locking ring, which goes inside the grease cap retaining nut. Behind that is the grease cap itself, followed by the split pin, the stub axle nut, and the stub axle nut washer. That is all that has to be removed to take the hub and the brake drum from the car. We will then take the bearings out for cleaning, inspection, and lubrication. Starting from the front of the hub, we have the outer bearing packing washer, the bearing spacer, the rear bearing, the outer race of which stays in the hub, the rear bearing retaining nut, the retaining nut locking tab, and the 4 3BA nuts and lock washers which secure it to these 4 studs. It should be noted here that the stub axle nut is left-hand threaded on the right or offside and right-hand threaded on the left or near side. In addition to the tools that you've rented from the Rolls-Royce Owners Club, you will have to supply a few extra tools to complete this job. First of all, a hide-faced or soft-faced hammer to remove the wheel nut with the wheel nut wrench. Next, you will need 2 small screwdrivers. This is to remove the wire locking ring from the grease cap retaining nut. The grease cap retaining nut spanner, which should be in your rental kit, and a Tommy bar to turn it. Next, remove the split pin with a pair of side cutters, and remove the stub axle nut with a 9/16 BSF socket on a breaker bar. This is the hub removal ring, which threads onto the wheel nut threads and is clamped on with a circular clamp. It's in 2 parts so that it fits either the left or right hand side. This puller engages between the end of the stub axle and the outside of this extractor ring, which, when the screw is turned with the adjustable wrench, will extract the hub from the stub axle. For the rears, in addition to these, we need a driving dog extractor, 3BA socket on either a nut driver or a 1/4" drive ratchet, and a long punch to drive out the front bearings when we get the hub on the bench. Having removed the wheel nut and the wheel, we're now ready to begin disassembly of the hub. First of all, remove the grease cap retaining nut locking ring. sometimes getting it out of the groove that it lives in is a little bit tough. There it goes. There's the locking ring. Next, we remove the grease cap retaining nut itself. Its direction of coming off is marked. There is a little word stamped in it that says off and an arrow of direction. The retaining nut and the grease cap. Next, we must remove the split pin from the stub axle nut. Now the stub axle retaining nut. And the retaining washer behind it. Now we must fit the hub extractor to the outer threads of the hub. Now the puller. Don't worry about the clicking noises that you hear as the hub comes off. It's just the inner and outer bearings sliding on the stub axle. There's the hub, complete with the bearings, and the brake mechanism left on the backing plate. Now we will go to the bench and take the bearings out of the hub. Now we have the hub off the car and on the bench. We're going to remove the bearings for cleaning, inspection, and lubrication. First thing to do is to remove the 4 3BA nuts from the locking ring. Next, we remove the inner bearing retaining ring. Do not be surprised if when you get to this stage you will find some of these teeth have been badly damaged. In the past, people who tried to remove these without the correct tools have used punches and cold chisels on them, and you're more than likely going to find that the teeth are badly damaged. This is the correct tool for removing this ring. Remember, when reassembling this ring does not hold the whole car together. It is only necessary to tighten this retaining ring snugly to prevent the bearing from moving. Now we lift out the rear bearing, which comes out and leaves the outer race in the hub. The bearing spacer. Now, to remove the front bearing, as you look down inside the hub, you will see the packing washer in back of the front bearing. This is so that we can drive the bearing out. With a long punch, moving the punch around to drive out evenly on the brace. There is the outer race. The bearing should be well cleaned in either a started solvent, gasoline or kerosene, and then carefully blown dry. Never ever spin a bearing first without lubrication in it. You can turn it gently by hand like this, and you'll be able to feel if there are any rough spots in the bearing. Also look for any damage on the races or in the inner ball retainer. When you're assured the bearing is serviceable, it has to be packed with grease. Now, there are two ways of doing this. If you don't do it very often, you can do it just fine by doing it by hand, and that is done like this. Incidentally, the grease that's recommended for this is a disc brake grease. This happens to be Valvoline because it's what we use, but a disc brake grease has a high melting point, good lubrication qualities and will not come out of the bearings. So this is by far a superior grease to use. Bearings and hubs can get quite hot as a result of extended braking or a long downhill run, and the grease can become slightly molten and come out and get on the brake linings. Disc brake grease will not do that. Take a goodly glob of grease on your hand and just start working it into the bearing, first on the one side, like that, then turn it over and fill it from the other side. So the bearing is completely filled with grease from both sides. Now, if you don't like getting quite that dirty, this little gadget is for packing bearings with grease. It can be bought from J.C. Whitney or any of the aftermarket supply houses for less than $5. And what you do is take your bearing, we have another bearing here which is dry, and put it on the base. Wind the top down on it tight, and then using a grease gun with the same kind of grease in it, just lever this down and it will pack into the bearing and fill it completely. You know it's filled completely when you can pick the bearing up, look inside, and you will see grease has squished out all around the bottom of the bearing. As you can see, there's a ring of grease all the way. Let me remove the top, it'll be a little easier to see. Grease is squished out all the way around the bottom of the bearing, and it is absolutely full of grease. There's the bearing, absolutely packed solid with grease from both sides. Just take out the lump in the middle, and you are ready to put the bearing back into the hub. First thing to go back into the hub on reassembly is this washer, which goes in back of the bearing, the bevel side towards the bearing. Drop that in. The bearing, this front bearing, being a ball bearing, goes in either way. Just put that down into there. Get it fairly straight. Start it very lightly with hammer blows on only on the outer ring of the bearing. This is just to start it and get it in square. Then pick up your punch. Use a steel punch rather than a brass punch, because a brass punch will tend to chip and will put little slivers of brass in the bearing. Bearing is now solidly down into its housing. There it is. Now we turn the hub over. And the next thing to do is to take the bearing spacer, put a thin coat of grease on the outside of it. This is mainly to stop it from rattling around. Also collect any dirt or dust that might find its way in there. And that goes down and sits in the center. Now the outer bearing, which being unlike the front bearing is a roller bearing, to pack this requires a smear of grease on the outside. This, unfortunately, you cannot pack using the bearing, grease bearing packer that we use on the front one. And some grease on the inside of the race, and drop the bearing squarely into its housing. The bearing retaining nut . Now, as I said before, this does not hold the whole car together. Screw it down until it bottoms out. Put the wrench on it. And just snug it down so that two of the teeth line up so that you can get the locking plate back on again. There. Now we have two holes lining up. Drop the locking plate back on. Drops into those two little slots, prevents the ring from turning. 4 lock washers. Please use new lock washers. Never use a lock washer twice. And 4 3BA nuts. And tighten them down. Hub is now ready to be reinstalled back on the car. We're now ready to reinstall the hub on the car. While the hub is off, be sure and clean this area of old grease and dirt on the stub axle. Check the action of the brakes. Make sure they are free. Clean out any old brake dust and oil that might be in there. If you blow it out with an air hose, don't breathe it because that's asbestos dust. Do it outside if possible, or use a vacuum cleaner, even better, to clean the dust out. Wipe the linings off both sides with lacquer thinner if they're oily, and then you are ready to reinstall the hub. Enter the hub onto the stub axle. Bearings will find their own place. And there it is, that's partially on now. Take a big block of wood, piece of 2x4, and your heavy hammer and drive the hub firmly onto the stub axle. Then take the axle nut washer, the axle nut. Bear in mind there are two sets of split pin holes in the stub axle, in the vertical and horizontal axis. Either you can use, whichever which way it lines up. That looks like it's just about in line with the vertical axis. Now, if you have trouble getting the pin in, something you can do is to take and put a slight bend in it. Just about that much should do, which will help you get the pin into the hole. The bend in the pin allows you to get it into the hole in the axle and still clear the inside of the hub. And just straighten it out and push the pin down in. Straighten the pin out a little bit so that it goes down in. Straighten the pin out and then just work it down into the bottom hole. With a screwdriver if you can. They're sometimes quite difficult to get in. There's not very much room in here to work. And often you will find that it's very hard to get the bottom part of the pin in. This is one of those times. I think it is go again now. There she goes. Get the head straight so that it goes right down into the castellations of the nut, and bend the ends back as far as you can. Then we take the grease cap, put that on, the retaining nut and its spanner. Be sure that the legend where it says off is facing you, because it will go on either way. This is left-hand threaded, so we tighten up in this direction. Now, a very useful tool to get the locating holes in line for this is a common, ordinary ice pick. There are a series of holes around the outside of the hub, up in here. One of these is going to line up with the hole in the retaining nut. That seems to be it right there. Put the tang of the locking pin in. We'll go up through the hole in the retaining nut into the hole in the hub, and then just lever this into its slot. Until it falls snugly into the slot. The construction of the rear hub is very similar to the front. Working from the outside of the hub in, we have the spring locking tab, the grease cap retaining ring with its direction of rotation to remove it stamped into it, the grease cap, the axle nut, the split pin or cotter pin, in this case which has been pre-bent, ready to put it back in, the axle nut washer, a spacer washer that goes between the axle nut washer and the driving dog. Now, the driving dog is the first piece that is different from the front axle. The outer splines engage in the inside of the hub. The inner splines engage on the axle shaft. The driving dog retaining nut, the retaining nut lock tab washer, which mounts on these three 3BA studs, the 3BA nuts and lock washers. On the hub itself, we have the inner bearing retaining ring lock tab, the inner bearing ring retainer, the inner bearing. This is an original bearing with a brass cage, as all the Rolls-Royce and Bentley bearings are. The bearing spacer and the front or outer bearing. This happens to be a German FAG bearing which has replaced an original, but any good quality ball bearing will do just fine. We'll now remove the rear. To remove the rear hubs, we start exactly the same way as we did with the front. That is to remove the spring circlip that locks the grease cap retaining nut. Due to the fact there's so little room inside the Bentley hubs, these are sometimes a bit of a problem to get out because they keep springing back into the groove. I'm sorry, my arm is in the way. You can't see much of what I'm doing here, but I'm prying the ring out of its groove. And there it goes. And there is the ring out. Now we'll remove the grease cap retaining nut. Now its direction of rotation is marked on it. You should just be able to see the off at the top and a little arrow pointing to the left, which indicates it comes off. It's a normal right-hand thread, comes off the proper way. As the hub is now free to turn, you can reach back under the chassis to one of the brake cables, pull it down sharply, and that will hold the drum enough for you to turn the wrench. There is the grease cap and the grease cap retaining nut. Next thing to get rid of is the split pin, or cotter pin, that holds the axle nut. A pair of side cutters, get a hold of the leg and drag it forward. Get a hold of the other leg, and bend it forward. The side cutters on the top, and just start levering upwards and it'll come right out. Of course, we're going to use a new split pin. Don't ever try to save the old ones. Next is the axle nut, the 9/16 BSF socket. Again, lock the brake drum by pulling down the brake cable and undo the nut. And there's the nut, followed by the washer, followed by a little thin packing ring which goes between the washer and the driving dog. Now the driving dog is the first piece we come to, which is different from the front hubs. And for that we use a driving dog extractor, which is this little tool, 2 1/4-inch BSF bolts which screw into 2 tapped holes in the driving dog. The center screw is then screwed down against the end of the shaft, and that will extract the dog. They don't have to be screwed in a long way, but about 1/4 inch, just to give them sufficient bite to pull the driving dog out. Driving dogs usually pull out quite easily unless they've been badly damaged. A worn driving dog will practically fall out. There we are. There is the driving dog on the driving dog extractor. The next thing to come out is the wheel nut itself. This really literally does hold the whole car together. The wheel nut is here secured by a three-tanged lock washer held with 3 3BA nuts and lock washers. Always try to keep track of what comes out. A lock washer left in somewhere to float around can do disastrous things. And of course, always use a new lock washer, as we said before. There's the 3 nuts, the lock washers. Now this is another piece that sometimes can be tricky to get out, because you've got to clear 3 studs and 3 3 little tabs. Sometimes takes a little bit of fishing and fiddling to get it to come off the 3 tabs and the 3 studs at the same time. You'll find it'll go in very easily, but it's quite reluctant sometimes to come out. You can move the axle shaft around a little bit to help you fiddling out here, but generally it will hang up on one or the other and just rock back and forwards and be very irritating to get out. This is one of them. It's just slid right back onto its studs again. Hanging up on the bottom stud down here, and it's almost impossible to get behind it. Try a slightly larger screwdriver might help. There it comes. And it's only held on one stud. There it is. As you can see, there are 3 tabs in here and 3 studs which you have to clear to get it out. Now we'll undo that. Now this also has the direction of rotation marked on it. In this case it's a normal right-hand thread. And there is the axle nut. We're now ready to extract the hub, which we do the same way we did at the front. There are 2 little divided pieces here. One there. Tighten up the clamp. These tools are not exactly the same as the tools you will find in the rental kit that you get from the Rolls-Royce Owners Club. These are tools made up to use in our own shop, which were made up as we needed them and generally from materials which we happen to have around. But you should have no trouble in identifying the tools that you get from the club which do the same thing. Wind the extractor in, puller rather, until it contacts the center of the shaft. And extract the hub from the axle. And there's the hub off the car. Now you can see the construction of the rear brakes. There are 2 sets of brake shoes in here. The outer shoe is the foot brake, which is worked by 1 cable, and the inner one is the hand brake, which I think you can just see the linkage working over here. Before we put the hub back on, we want to clean this whole area out, preferably with a vacuum cleaner to remove the dust, which is asbestos dust, and you really should blow it off and breathe it. But more of that later. Now let's go to the bench and take the bearings out of the hub. Construction of the rear hub is slightly different from the front. As you'll notice, it's slightly different in here, the bearing retainer, a different kind of bearing retainer, different teeth. Otherwise, the basic construction of the hub is similar. To take the hub apart, the first thing we must do is to remove the two 3BA nuts down here which hold a locking tab in place. These are two 3BA square-headed bolts which go through the hub to the outside. Remove the nuts. Pick up the lock washers. And pry out the little clip. And there's the locking clip. When you get to this point, don't be surprised if the teeth around the outside of the retainer are badly damaged. This is because in the past people have tried to remove them with cold chisels, punches, heavy hammers, and other instruments of torture. The correct tool for removing them is this. While this is not a Rolls-Royce tool, this is a tool, a duplicate of the Rolls-Royce tool, made in our own shops for the purpose of removing this part. Thread is very snug fitting on here. It's quite tight to remove. And there's the retainer. Inside the retainer is a red fiber washer. This is a padding piece that goes between the nut and the outer face of the bearing. Be sure it's still in there when you put it back. It must be in. Here's the rear bearing. Unlike the front hub, the bearing, both bearings and the spacer come out in one direction, that is this way towards the rear. So what we will do now is to turn the hub over and drive it out from the front. The front bearing will push the spacer and the rear bearing out with it. Using a steel punch, a medium-sized hammer. As I mentioned before, a steel punch rather than a brass one, because a brass one will chip and put pieces of brass into the bearing. Starting on the bearing, tap around evenly. The rear bearing, the spacer, and the front bearing can now drop down inside the hub. Turn the hub over, and there is the inner spacer, the rear bearing, and the front bearing. And these have been lubricated, but we'll describe lubricating them just for general principles. When you have the bearings out, be sure and lay them on either a clean rag or a clean piece of paper towel, because when they're sticky with grease, they are very prone to pick up dirt, grit, other foreign matter. We described during the front hubs how to lubricate the bearings, using preferably a bearing greasing fixture like this, which does a much better job than doing it by hand, although you can do it by hand. Now we've seen them taken out, we'll put them back in again. I'm just wiping some of the excess grease off them. When you put them back in, take the smaller bearing first, the inner bearing, drop it down the hole, and you will feel it locate on the edge of the housing that it's going into. Take a longer punch and start light hammer blows, driving only on the outside of the bearing, and get it started down in the housing. When it's down solidly in the housing, the note changes, and you know you're down tight. Take your spacer, which you've coated with a thin coating of grease, put it down the middle. Don't worry about centralizing it, because it will be centralized when it's put on the axle. Take your rear bearing, get it started in the housing as square as you can. Using light hammer blows, start it down, making sure that you start it square. Just work around it and take it all the way down. Hammering only on the edge of the bearing. That is down solid. Wipe off. Take the bearing retainer, checking to make sure that the red fiber washer is in place inside. And screw it down. As we said before, excessive tightening is neither necessary nor desirable. This should be tightened down just snug. And we have to finish up with one spline in a right position to get the little clip back into place. Right. Drop the little clip over the two studs. It has dropped into the hole between the two splines. Two new lock washers, please. The two 3BA nuts. And tighten them down. That completes this stage of the operation. Now we'll go back and put the hub on the car. After we've cleaned out the hub, vacuumed the dust out, wiped everything reasonably clean, it's time to replace the hub. When you put the hub on, you will have to centralize the bearing spacer. Goes on. seems to have centralized itself. Then take a 2x4, a padded hammer, and drive the hub back onto the axle. Next thing we have to fit is the axle nut, which is a standard right-hand thread. The direction, by the way, the handing of the thread is marked on the nut. This should be pulled up tight. This literally does hold the rear wheels on. There is a tab washer that secures this, and you will notice that one hole and one tab are opposite each other. If you can get this same lineup inside, it makes it much easier to get on. I have got to go just back just a tiny bit. I've tightened it just a little bit too much. Now we have a stud and a tab space directly opposite. It's dropped in there. Little tap with a punch to make sure it's all the way down. And that's in. New lock washers. When you come to put the little nuts back on, if you're using a nut driver, you may find that the nut has a tendency to fall down too far into the nut driver to be able to catch on the stud. If so, put a little piece of paper in it, take up a little space, drop your nut into the nut driver, and then you can get it on the stud. Well, that one doesn't seem to want to. I think I had it in there just slightly crooked. There it is. Lock washer. The main trouble you will find with the Bentley hubs is the lack of space to work in. It's very, very tight quarters in here. It requires very small fingers. Again, I didn't have the nut in the nut driver quite all the way. And we have one here that's reluctant to go on. Ah, there it is. There's the locking tab in place. Next part to go in is the driving dog. You'll find it easier to keep the driving dog on the extractor. It gives you something to hang on to it with and to turn it. You'll notice the axle shaft in here is free to float. That is quite normal and is supposed to do it. You'll also find, unless the driving dogs are very badly worn, they will only want to go on in possibly one or sometimes two positions. Get it on the spline first, on the axle spline, and then line it up with the splines in the hub. You sometimes have to fiddle it just a little bit to get it in. You also, it's hard to see the splines to start with, to get them properly lined up. This apparently does not want to go in on the spline setting that we have, so we'll take it out and rotate it one spline on the axle shaft. See if it likes that setting any better. It seems to like that a little better. There it goes. Then just tap it home, take the extractor off, and seat the driving dog the rest of the way. And here it goes up, comes up solid, you know it's all the way in. Next thing is the little spacer washer which goes over the axle shaft and against the driving dog. The axle nut washer with the bevel side facing outwards, and the axle nut. Tighten the axle nut. Again, lock the brake drum by reaching in and holding one of the brake cables. Pull down on it. And so you can see where your split pin hole is. A little more. And the split pin hole is lined up in the vertical axis. Take a 1/8 inch cotter pin. If you bend it just slightly, it helps you get it in because of the lack of space in here. Just get it in, start it in, and then push it, and it drops right down into place. Pull it down, pull the head down into the castellations, and spread the pin. Try to turn on me. we are, bending it up. And seat the legs of the cotter pin down with a punch. That's that. Next we have the grease retaining cap and the grease retaining cap nut. As we said before, this needs only to be snug. It doesn't need to be dead tight. Then we have to locate the hole for the locking ring to go in. There are a series of holes around the outside. A thin ice pick put through each hole in turn will show us where the hole is that will line up. I think that's it right there, which will line up between the outer hole and the hole in the retaining nut. Take the clip, insert the tang into the hole, and lever it in. This can be a job to try men's souls. And can either go in a matter of seconds or a matter of minutes. And there it is. It's flopped right into the groove that is locking it, and the tang has gone up into the hole on the outside. That completes the assembly of the rear hub. Be sure that the drum is free to turn. A slight rubbing of the brake drums is not unusual, and they will centralize themselves when the car is moving. Thank you.